Obviously, you'll remember from this morning Patrick Drazen and Roland Kelts from earlier this afternoon. And I'd also like to introduce Fred Schodt, who did all of those wonderful Tezcot translations and has written a number of books, and one of them is out there. And then Jenny Prough, and Jenny Prough is a professor at Valparaiso University, my alma mater, so I'm very happy to have this wonderful panel here, and we're going to discuss what was going on before you, and I'll facilitate questions from the audience as well. So please feel free to ask what on earth was going on. If you, it's such a rich visual, so I don't know who wants to go first or who has some ideas, but basically I guess I can throw the question out there, what was going on?
I guess I have the microphone first. I guess watching it this time, after having heard all the presentations today, I was struck by how many themes, and just to note, I'm not directly answering the question at the moment,
That's fine.
but how many themes that were touched on today appeared in this movie. I mean, directly this notion of dreams, and Roland, you addressed, I think it was Laurie Anderson's notion of dreams, right? That sort of in America we have this dreams are our aspirations and our goals, but there's another way that dreams can sort of be more mystical or give us a sense of what's going on today, and that certainly is the case with the dreams here, perhaps. And then we have issues with science and technology, this youngish girl as a main character, and then clearly multiple levels of reality, and those are all issues that sort of came up over the course of today. So I'm going to start by just throwing that out there, the way that this is sort of linked into our wider conversation, and maybe through talking we can pull some of those things together.
And one more issue that came up a little earlier today in a way that I was able to pick up from this particular viewing. There seems to be a very fine line between the actual heritage of a culture, if you will. A lot of the artifacts that appeared in this movie just sort of mixed in willy-nilly with consumer goods. And it's a very fine line between heritage and kitsch. And I think that's one of the hazards, if you will, posed by the whole Moe thing. I think that was sort of hinted at here, although it was never expressly stated. It's one of the things you have to kind of work at, I think, to decode this movie, at least in part.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed too was just how many things were in that parade and kind of the carnival aspect. I mean, it was like this parade going to nowhere, leading off kind of the deep edge of psychosis, and everybody was so happy about it, you know, like breaking out of their reality, you know, all the Saroriman at the end kind of doing the Olfals kind of thing and dropping off the side, you know, it's kind of ready to...
Professor Williams, basically, that's the choreography from the old Professor Williams movie.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of striking right off the bat. You know, where are they going? They don't really know, but they're happy to go there. So.
I notice we're all avoiding the question of explaining the plot of the film because I think it should be really enjoyed on its own. To me, it's just a wonderful description of a description of a dream, and I've seen the movie 3 times now, and I think I could watch it another 2 or 3 times and sort of gradually understand the details. But I was looking at it in particular because of the theme of the seminar today, or the conference today, was postmodern, and last night when we were having dinner, I was asking what postmodern really means, because I frankly don't fully understand the definition completely. But if I interpret it on my own to mean sort of a deconstruction of a monolithic value system and a fracturing of a monolithic value system, then there's a lot of postmodern elements in this movie. And actually, one thing that I printed out some stuff, some interviews I saw with the director before I came here, and unfortunately, the best one I didn't read until just earlier, but he has a fabulous description of the parade. and relates to what Patrick said and others said. So I might just roughly give you an idea of what he described. This is Satoshi Kon, the director, and he was actually in an interview in The Guardian, and he was asked, what does this shared dreaming idea, what does that symbolize and where does it come from? And he responded, he said that the parade was intended to symbolize Japan as it is today, where it tends to be dreamy and a little over giddy. And he uses in Japanese, it's parade wa yume megachi de ukareteru nihon no genjou o shouchou shita tsumori desu. So that's my loose translation, that it's intended to symbolize modern Japan that's a little dreamy and over giddy. And he said that actually the parade is also, it is a motif that has a lot of contradictions in it, and it's an attempt to depict, in attempting to depict this twisted reality, it was very difficult for me, but it was also a lot of fun. And he goes on to say that the elements that that comprise the parade are also symbolized of things that have been abandoned in Japan. And this relates a little bit, I think, to what Patrick said earlier. He said the Buddhist icons and the Shinto tori, the arch over the Shinto shrines, those represent the weakening or the fading of religiosity in Japan compared to former times. And also, he says that the Daruma dolls that appear, and the welcoming cat that appears, and then the Fukugami, the 7 gods, which are imported from China, those are intended to symbolize traditional elements and traditional things in Japanese society that have now become reduced to cheap souvenirs. And then he also said finally that then there are many consumer items that have been replaced and exchanged over the years in the course of our period of high economic growth, when everybody was just desiring more and more consumer items. So things like the electronic goods and the furniture represent those things, and they're crying out to us not to be forgotten. So that kind of illustrates the parade and relates to a little bit what you were talking about earlier, I think, Patrick.
Oddly enough, it also echoes something that Miyazaki said about the time that Spirited Away came out. And he was saying that one of the reasons he made that movie and forged the mythology within it was because he thought, I put it that way because I don't think he was quite correct when he thought it, but he thought that the older traditional children's stories like Kachi Kachiyama or The Swallow's Nest or whatever didn't have the power to hold a young audience today that it used to. I do disagree with that. In the hands of a superior storyteller, you can still find fresh juice, if you will, some good material there. It's just a matter of bringing it out. Kahn here, I'm afraid, doesn't take that long a view of it. I mean, to him, it's all this stuff has just sort of been thrown out there, and it's just sort of competing in the streets, quite literally, for attention. And there's no attempt to isolate what's good, what's bad, what's valuable, and what's trash. And I think that's somewhat indicative more of a more pessimistic worldview, I think, than Miyazaki's.
Maybe it's a very postmodern worldview.
Yeah, and on that note too, none of those items sort of come back at the end. I was struck in the ending, at the beginning of the end, I guess. You see that blue sky, which suddenly looks really realistic, and you're struck by how different the progression had looked in the film, especially with the parade. And I think from that point on, with the exception of the characters, the scenery gets quite realistic. But but then none of those consumer items or even traditional items sort of come back in any other way. So there's not sort of some end message of, and this can remain in our lives or come back in. It seems to be all quite thoroughly purged by the end of the movie, right?
But what we do get at the end of the movie, is a multiplex that is showing nothing but Satoshi Kon movies. Which, it's an in-joke, it's acceptable, but frankly, it gives me a chance to say that I still think that Millennium Actress is probably his masterwork. It is a virtuoso turn, and it is a love story to the movies. I mean, it actually demonstrates that Cohn likes this medium, and there's a lot there that he can draw on that touches him and that he can use to touch us. I really think it's a much more affirmative movie. Tokyo Godfather is the same way, since it's a remake of John Ford under wonderfully modern terms, very postmodern, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, but what I found interesting, though, about all that with the procession of all of these items, both kitsch, traditional, and kind of so daigomi, what have you, the garbage that's put on the curb. You have all these things put together, but the way it's resolved is that you have this guy who's a glutton in real life that is sort of an otaku that everybody kind of gives a hard time, and this woman who obviously loves him but can't admit it. She's like a split personality. He has to ingest both personalities, and they have to create a spiritual child who then goes up against the Rijicho, who knows where he's going. I mean, he's all over the place. I'm going to protect the dreams, but he's Shiva. He's trying to destroy the whole thing and create his own kind of apocalypse like we were talking about. And in this case, they are not really trying to defend against the end, but they're trying to keep them all from being sucked into his reality. So they're kind of trying to preserve their own sense of reality and then redistinguish themselves after this kind of spiritual child grows up and then vanishes.
She consumes him at the end. Yeah. She consumes him entirely at the end. I mean, I think this is produced by a studio, some of you may know Madhouse Productions, and they're one of three, I think, sort of cutting edge or leading edge anime production houses in Japan. The others, I think, Production IG and Studio 4C, 4 Degrees C. And to me, this particular film is a sign of animation in Japan reaching a stage of advanced maturity, which can have good and bad implications. But in the sense that, as in many narrative art forms, they often reach a point where they become self-reflexive. This, to me, is very much an anime about anime, referring to a lot of the archetypes of Japanese animation, the dolls that come to life, the animistic nature of Shinto, of assuming that, or believing that there's a spirit animating every object, everything. Also addressing the apocalyptic themes of classics like Akira, Evangelion, but doing so in a referential way. You expect the end of the world, right? And then even clearly the agent of change is a female character, but as you just said, she's divided into two selves who don't necessarily get along with one another or want the same thing. And the power figure at the end, the sort of, what I see as a kind of, post-war hubris, a comment on the hubris of wanting to be all-powerful, is ultimately reconsumed by the strong, surviving female character at the end of the story. So many of the references in this film seem to be, in a way, like sly winks about anime themselves, just as I think certain identified as postmodern novelists, certain writers, probably Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo, Robert Coover in particular, are referring to the act of writing a novel in their novels, in their writing. So I think this film fits that condition very well.
I might just add on to that, in addition to being self-referential, I think in a way it's actually quite a self-indulgent film. I think the director had a wonderful time making this film, and I actually saw, it may be just my imagination, but a lot of in-jokes in animation. If you're animation fans, you know that animators always put in a lot of in-jokes because they get bored. You have to draw spend a lot of hours alone and work hard. The Tokita, the fat guy, the otaku, to me, in my mind at least, he has to be inspired by Okada Toshio, who is in Japan known as the Otaking, who just recently put out this book saying that otaku is dead and he lost about 150 pounds. And also the chief of the research lab, the short man, I am almost sure that that's modeled after the head of Madhouse Studios, Maruyama, because actually I just saw Maruyama, I guess 2 months ago in Baltimore, and he looks an awful lot like that. So I think they're having a lot of fun. But even if it is very self-referential and even self-indulgent, I thought that since this is actually a movie based on a novel, a famous novel in Japan by Japan's premier, one of the premier science fiction novelists, Tsutsui Yasutaka, it was very appropriate. And apparently there was an attempt to make a live-action film out of this, which I think would have been a total disaster. This is a film that really, I think, demands animation. And I actually think it is a wonderful medium to depict a dream, because our dreams are so chaotic that in a way this is a very faithful depiction of a dream world, I thought.
Yeah, well, when we were hanging out last night, we kind of talked a little bit about that. Why animate versus live action, right? I mean, what makes people want to create an animated picture like this? Well, you can't do it in reality. It's harder to try to portray anything like this in a live action. You're going to have to CG the whole thing anyway, and it wouldn't be as colorful. And then second, just cost. It would just cost a fortune to do it. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, actually, just as a bit of self-referential trivia, apparently the two bartenders that you see in the radio bar, which he accesses online, I believe the taller one is voiced by Satoshi Kon, the director himself, and the shorter one is the author. Fred just referred to Tsutsui-san, the novelist. From whose work this emanates. Tsutsui-san, by the way, I think it's fair to say is a kind of an iconic novelist in Japan at this point, a sci-fi novelist, and has been in vogue quite recently. Some of you may know another beautiful animated film that came out a couple of years ago in English called The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, and that is also based on one of his novels. So he's in vogue, I think, at the moment.
I was actually fascinated by this because in reading about Tsutsui, apparently this story was originally serialized in Marie Claire, which is a magazine in Japan for women, which is sort of like a cross between, I don't know, Cosmo and 17 or Vogue or something like that, and then compiled into a book. But I was also intrigued by the manga link because I'm a kind of a manga guy, and Tsutsui, in his homepage, he lists as his special skills or abilities. One of them is, in addition to social dancing, manga. And many of his works have been made into manga. And also, the director, Satoshi Kon Satoshi, before he became an animated film director, he was a manga artist, and he actually published a few works. And he said in an interview with The Guardian that actually he just loved to draw, and that's how he wound up moving over to animation. He said it was a totally seamless switch for him, because for him it was just the ability to keep drawing, and he loved that aspect of it. So there's a real strong manga link in this film as well.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add the imagery that you see in this film, the quite deliberately comical, almost comic hysterical mishmash of Western influences, you know, Tarzan and Jane, and a kind of 007 style Hollywood action film. All of that, I find quite skillfully accomplished. Again, as a commentary on that, particularly generations of post-war Japanese who had this stuff kind of tossed at them without a real strong sense of context. So I think Kon almost gets at that what is Tarzan to a Japanese audience, you know, in the post-war years? What does it mean? What do these iconic images, you know, if you noticed in the parade of the consumerist iconographic parade, the Statue of Liberty is marching along with the Daruma dolls, and it's this sort of wonderful depiction of a kind of grotesquerie, these Western or American symbols tossed into the mix of a centuries-old culture, and what do they mean, and do they stand for anything anymore?
Don't you think it's very Tokyo, though? When I look at this, I mean, they're sort of depictions of nature on the periphery, but they're very much on the periphery. To me, it's really like going into one of the discount electronic shops in Akihabara or Shinjuku, where you have a zillion different colors and you have a zillion different stereos and computers all blaring music at the same time, and it's this sort of cacophony of imagery and colors and very chaotic. To me, it was just completely modern Tokyo.
Also, I think that I'd like to pick up on what Patrick said too, because I think you were talking about the question of where religious iconography becomes kitsch. And I was thinking of, there's this area of Tokyo called Asakusa, and the temple, which is a habitual tourist attraction. And lining the route to the temple steps, it's stall after stall of kitschy Japanese iconography, which to the untutored tourist seems like collectibles that have some kind of religious meaning. But by the time they've reached those stalls, first of all, they're all made in China, and they're little plastic replicas of things, and they're relatively cheap. But I do think that this film questions, well, does that have any meaning anymore, or is it simply the sign, the symbol, divorced from any connection to what it once stood for?
And that's a nice point too, because that road on your way to Asakusa is very much like that parade, because you'll have a little stall with food, and then a little stall with little statues, and then like Pokemon masks, and then so there's like stuff for kids and not, and some traditional stuff and some not, and it really is. Yeah. It's really eclectic. It has the feeling of that parade, or the parade has the feeling of it.
And that's kind of funny. I mean, I don't want to be self-referent to my own talk, but to talk at least a little bit on the Baudrillard side again, he talked originally about how these simulacra really were originally icons that were supposed to represent God, and then the icon becomes the symbol for God, and then the icon gets the power of God, and you don't believe in God anymore, you believe in the power of the icon, and then the icon loses all meaning, and then it's this thing that was once worshipped but has no connection to any type of ritual anymore. So you kind of lose that over the time. So maybe it does touch on that just a little bit. So, but what about, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, kind of on the anthropological level, the idea of honne and tatemae. Anybody in the audience, you know what that is? A little bit? Okay. Well, do you want to talk about that, Jenny, a little bit?
Sure. It's basically, honne is the notion of your innermost feelings, or your innermost self to an extent, your real feelings. And tatemae is what you show to the outer world. And where those lines are depend on sort of who you're with and how well they know them. But that's the notion of that there's this inner self and the self that you expose or project to the outer world. At least that's traditionally how it's used.
Yeah, well, this is a long-standing dichotomy in Japanese culture. Again, there is the house, there is the family, there is the people you are closest to, and then there is the outside world, where it is a potential source of pollution, which is why you take your shoes off right at the door, because you don't want to drag anything in that shouldn't be there. This dichotomy is ancient, it's long-standing, and it has been internalized probably to the point where most Japanese don't even realize it, that they're acting it out 100 times a day.
Yeah, and That's good. That's a real good explanation for the Uchi-Soto dynamic. Because what I see with Paprika herself is this kind of facade. You know, her Tatemai is kind of her true self at that point, the black-haired girl, the Achan. Yeah. And the Paprika figure is really her honne, and then they get out of whack because the honne says, "You think you're always right," and then, you know, who are you to tell me what to do? And it's like they get into this conflict with one another, and then all of a sudden, then they're merged. And at the end, when she's talking to Tokuta-san and kind of showing her love for him while he's in the hospital bed, it's sort of like the Paprika voice comes out. The little bit of a girlishness comes out. It's sort of like they've fused, and there's no longer this dividing wall between honne and tatemai for her, and she's sort of reborn. At least it seemed to me.
I'm afraid to psychoanalyze the characters in this movie because it seems like a movie that's almost about psychoanalysts to begin with. On a modern, in keeping with the theme of modern Japan and postmodern Japan, another thing the theme that is not overt in this film that really struck me was that I think in Japan right now the animation industry is sort of trying to figure out what direction to go, because as Roland had indicated earlier, one of the hallmarks of Japanese animation and manga is line art, the sort of two-dimensional quality, whereas the American animation industry is very much going now all 3D, Pixar look. In Japan, I think the studios have been struggling to retain this sort of unique Japanese quality of anime that we all like. And I see there's a Death Note fan in here. And it's been a real challenge because of labor costs. You obviously have to start computerizing some things, and you also have to start farming out work just because it's such a labor-intensive process. And if you notice in the credits, there's a lot of Korean names. And actually almost all Japanese films today that come out, you'll see in the credits, if you look carefully, there's a lot of Korean names because a lot of the labor-intensive work is being farmed out to Korea. But the computer graphics is implemented in a very skillful way so that you still have this anime look. The characters themselves have this two-dimensional line drawing, outline kind of, even though there's shading used, but it still has that traditional Japanese quality. But the backgrounds have become increasingly three-dimensional, and a lot of those are now rendered with computer graphics. And I think they've very skillfully merged the 2D and 3D look in this film. But that, to me, also sort of symbolized modern Japan and the modern, the status of the modern animation industry.
That's particularly highlighted if you compare the film we just watched, the clip from Tetsuan Atom Boy Astro Boy that's about to come out, right? And which is like almost, I don't even know, super round in some way, right? It's very, very, it's not 3D, which is the other thing that the American cartoon industry is doing right now. Almost every movie's coming out 3D, but there's just a lot of depth to the Astro Boy commercial. So they are keeping so far that anime feel here.
I think also in connection to what Fred was just saying about the industry itself. I think it's one can't overstate how difficult the animation industry is in Japan right now. It's they're losing money. They're actually now losing money at home, partly because the domestic market is shrinking. There's a declining population of young people, and partly because there are fewer young animators coming up in the Japanese industry. The pay is really awful. The conditions are quasi-sweatshop. And many young Japanese who do have the talent are going into fields like video game development, or web design, and so on, where the paycheck is more comfortable and the conditions are better and the labor less intensive. So you have really something like Satoshi Kon is almost at the moment the last generation of great animators in Japan. And I actually just reviewed a new film from the same production house, Madhouse, which is called Redline, which is coming out, I think, next year. It'll be out in theaters, and it very similarly in tone, it is an anime about anime. And I think that generation, that was made by Ishikoike, is the screenwriter, and these guys are, it seems to me that they're either reaching a breaking point where everything they're doing now is becoming self-referential about what has come before, or they're trying to expand what they believe Japanese animation can do, because it's also very fast-paced. It's a racing film that almost seems to be about racing films. It's a mecha film built into a racing film. So there are robots and elaborate giant robot creatures. There are aliens from another planet. One of the racers is an anime babe who is competitive and quirky and has a squeaky voice and is very ambitious, more ambitious than the men in the film. So you have a lot of these tropes, but quite clearly the director and the screenwriter and the artists are self-conscious of them. And they're almost saying, okay, you guys know what this is, now let's have fun with it. Let's take it over the top to the next level.
It sounds to me like there's also, and I think you probably just said that in a different way, that the industry is very much aware that it's kind of not at a dead end, but at a stopping place where something's got to give, and they've got to figure out what. In a way, it's interesting that Paprika here is an example of how you can make some changes, and the results may not be 100% successful, but it does sort of indicate the kind of way that the industry needs to go now. And I'm conscious of this because of the two aspects of the heroine. I'm looking over my shoulder here, and I see them both. And of course, they're both voiced by the same person, the same actress, the great Megumi Hayashibara, who also is a sense of dichotomy at this point. She did get married. She semi-retired from the business. She only takes a couple of select projects per year now, and this dual role is probably her greatest work in a long career of really great voice work.
I'd like to change the topic just a little bit. What can we deduce about Japan, or what Satoshi Kon is trying to say about Japan a little bit from this kind of extrapolation maybe, or maybe some assumptions we can make from what we saw? Yeah, what do you guys think? How about that? Anybody want to respond? I mean, I got a mic. You're a small group.
We have a little time left for questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, question, yeah.
In kind of the victory scene where the girl, the doll, grows up into a woman, and the character is naked. Now, my question is that, you know, based upon the discussion panel, the title, what does it say about Japan? You know, and so that's my question.
Not everybody's naked in Japan.
Well, I think one thing, in part, I think that is another self-referential point of the film. But I mean, we talked earlier. Several of the talks talked about one of the potential effects of sort of World War II was this kind of emasculation of Japan. And one of the things that came out of the 80s, and I think in particular in the 80s and then the early 90s, with postmodern theorists in Japan, is they talked a lot about the emasculation of Japan. And in fact, the shoujo, the young girl, is the main actor in Japan. And this would come up in my interviews too. I had one person say, well, in the 80s, you know, we started to, just before the bubble collapsed, and when the bubble collapsed, you know, that was the sort of the end of salaryman culture. And from there, young girls took over. Young girls are the consumers, they're running Japan. Well, that's not literally true, but it's palpable in the way it feels, and I think you can see that. That's very frequently the case in anime, that the main protagonist, or even if she's not the main character, the main actor, the one who does the most action in the film is actually a young girl. And we can see that here for sure, both with that dual character, but even more so with that sort of girl child that defeats the monster, and that's certainly true in Miyazaki and other things. So I wouldn't be willing to say, therefore young girls are running Japan, because that's not true. But certainly that is a theme, and I think it's playing with this notion of emasculation and tying women to particular kinds of consumption, and the way that the economy's changed from a production economy to a consumption economy. I think all those things are related.
Although, and if I could put a more positive spin on it, because I really don't think that there's anything threatening in remembering that Shinto is essentially a goddess cult. And this is, again, part of that mishmash of the Japanese heritage that they may not know what to do with in this day and age, but it's there, and it certainly came to the forefront of the climax of the movie.
Also, I don't know if any of you else got this vibe, but this time when I saw the film and saw the infant at the end who grows into the grown woman, grown version of Paprika, who then consumes, literally, the corrupt balding man, I couldn't help but think of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, which is an extraordinarily influential film for Japanese directors and anime artists. When I would ask, well, what films, etc. I mean, 2001 came up repeatedly. That one and probably Blade Runner for a slightly younger generation. But I couldn't help but think of that reference. You're coming to the end of this kind of apocalyptic story, and there's an infant there, a baby, that in this case grows back into a grown female version of Paprika, who consumes the corruption taking place.
And on the heels of that, Roland, do you think it has anything to do with the youth culture, maybe saying that the old guard isn't necessarily the way they want to go? They don't need protection from themselves, or they don't need their dreams protected by the old guard, that they're trying to move there themselves, or?
I don't know if Kohn is so much, if he's directly saying that, as much as he might be illustrating it, or illustrating how that's the cliche. That's another trope in anime. The young girls don't need you, old man. Right. But I don't feel like he's pursuing that earnestly. Yeah. I feel like he's winking at you as he presents these archetypes, and maybe even what's called in anime or manga fan service, right? Fan service, where the artist gives you a little peek of something titillating to sort of reward you for watching or reading. I feel like there was a wink of that in there too, that's sort of like, okay, you're gonna see her naked, right? You wanna see her naked, right? Ooh, here we go. So it gives you that at the end of the film, but again, almost as a commentary on that tradition in anime and manga.
Maybe I'm the only one who thought this too, but when I saw the naked man standing up and he gets distorted, and of course he eventually swallowed by the young woman, for the man, I was remembering Nausicaa, and there's the Kyoshinhe, the giant warrior god figures, and they kind of morph into something like that. So it's kind of it's a design that's been used elsewhere in animation. So I was thinking what you mentioned earlier, being very self-referential. Yeah, I think there's something there for fans.
Almost like the Chernobog on the Night on Bald Mountain with Fantasia. It's the same kind of summoning, where he's moving and sweeping and look at me. The same kind of movement. Yeah.
And in terms of, if postmodern, I don't know what it means, but you can correct me, but if it really means a sort of deconstructed, no monolithic anything anymore. I was struck by the music, too. I don't know if anyone else was. In the beginning, it reminded me of sort of a combination of Enya and the Mongolian Tuvan throat singing. It was very mix and match kind of
and
approach.
that kind of driving techno beat, which I like, so it's kind of... Yeah.
My name is Yoshiaki Shibusawa. I have two questions. Actually, one. I don't see many animes. Living for many years, belong to all the generation. But one thing I like about Japanese anime is those drawings. Drawing is very good. It's two. I think one is just out of, to me, it's not realistic. Big saucer eyes, you know, the moe type drawing, which doesn't appeal to me. But if you look at that picture out there, that's pretty good drawing. And my question is, maybe, Mr. Kelts, you said this is very labor-intensive work. So is this the peak of producing this type of anime? I'm not talking about the contents of the story. I'm talking about just graphics, just drawing. Because I draw myself, I'm interested in drawing. And one of the things that struck me as Japanese anime is that drawing is very, very good. You cannot produce this by computer. This is just by hand. And the people who can really draw and see the essence of the people's face, expression, the movement, the timing, it's very masterful. And I'm afraid, just listening to you, that if this is very labor-intensive work, maybe we won't have this in the future. That's my question and comment.
I think it's addressed to you. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, there are a number of younger artists I spoke to in Japan, and I would bring up the names, you know, Miyazaki and Kon Satoshi and Oshimamoru, some of the great directors. And, you know, they would often say, who is going to be better than them? You know, almost with an air of futility. Like, nobody's going to outdo those guys. But of course, art forms evolve and diversify in many fields, many disciplines, when you have, you know, as predecessors, William Shakespeare and Herman Melville, you know, you still practice the craft and develop new approaches to the craft. I actually had it's almost sacrilege in Japan to say anything critical about Tezuka Osamu Tezuka. But an editor, an older female editor, who would not let me use her name, said, now look at these manga and look at them next to Tezuka's work. And she said, the artists working today are much better in terms of sophistication and skill than Tezuka. So she said the form has evolved. She was not denying Tezuka's importance or his protean imagination and so on. But in many respects, the art that you see coming out of Japan, the best of the animation and manga artwork, is really at a peak. Whether it's finished and can go no further, I think that's a question to ask of younger artists who are practicing the craft, or you yourself as an artist practicing the craft. And oh yeah. But I still think, I mean, it may reach a leveling off point. You know, sometimes different disciplines reach a point where it seems like very little growth is happening, and then someone new comes along and shakes it up and takes it in a new direction. I think there's that hope in Japan. In fact, in the publishing world, people will say, we need the next Haruki Murakami, fast, you know. And certainly in the world of anime, people are looking for the next Miyazaki or Anno or Oshii, you know, looking for the next great artist.
I think actually that I agree completely with Roland. The level of draftsmanship and art in both the manga industry and the anime industry is incredibly high right now. And actually, I don't think there's a problem with the level of the artwork. What really people are worried about and should be worried about is storytelling ability. I think that's what's really suffered in the last few years. And part of it is this sort of self-referential style that's become so fashionable. And then another thing is that in the manga industry, for example, there are some people who are fabulous artists and their skills are wonderful, but they don't have enough time to develop life experiences so that they can tell really good stories. So there's been a kind of dilution of many of the manga stories. Many of the young artists, the editors are not fostering them and not giving them enough room to really develop as storytellers. But their draftsmanship is wonderful. So maybe in the near future, the real problem will not be art ability, because I think it's fabulous, but maybe the real problem is going to be storytelling and character designing capability.
Yeah, just to add to that, that's what people complain about in Hollywood now, is that everybody goes through, film school at New York University or UCLA, and they come out and they're bright.
And they're self-referential.
And they're self-referential. They've seen a lot of films, but they haven't lived. And they're writing these 3-act scripts, and they all look the same, cookie-cutter scripts.
One of the manga complaints that I've heard most recently is that the problem, if you could call it that, is coming from the publishers. If somebody gets a story picked up by Shonen Jump, then whatever plot the artist may have had in his head pretty much has to go out the window so that they can do a quote-unquote Shonen Jump type story. We saw this with Yu Yu Hakusho. We saw this with one of the most interesting new manga, Muyo and Roji. It all kind of devolves into card games after a while, Pokemon-style card games, but that is how they perceive their audience to use the manga that they publish. As for new animators, they are out there, and they're pretty self-evident. I really believe that Makoto Shinkai, who did Voices of a Distant Star, and then because of that and some other features that he basically produced at home on a Macintosh, got a full contract to start doing anime features and has done some beautiful work, very lyrical. And the guy who did the film version of The Girl Who Left Her Time. Yeah, these are all excellent animators, excellent directors, and there's some out there that we don't really know the names of yet because they're still coming up, but they are coming up, I believe this.
Yeah, I just want to add to that quickly that what you're talking about, the sort of do-it-yourself approach that's available to more and more artists now because of the technology. I just saw this this film called Paranormal Beings or Paranormal or something. It's a totally homemade movie. It's kind of being talked about as the next Blair Witch, if you remember the Blair Witch Project. And it's a handheld camera and something, and it's genuinely the most terrifying horror film I've seen in maybe decades. And it was, I think Spielberg who finally picked it up and threw some money at it, but it was made on $10,000 budget by these, indie filmmakers. So I think that kind of thing, just to follow up on what Patrick's saying, is also happening where you can go outside the studio more and more if you have the talent.
I have a couple of questions, and I could not quite follow some of the discussions you had earlier, so I'm revisiting to sort out my thinking. When Chris said, well, let's talk about what this film means about Japan, I wasn't really sure what you concluded on this particular question. I do remember earlier we started talking about different levels of storytelling, different themes. It's a very complex movie. At one point we talked about tension between science and technology and humanity, or issues of loneliness and a dream, and how releasing oneself in that sort of timeless world. So I'd like to know one more time, what do you think about this film tells us about Japan in the 21st century? And then next question is, Roland repeatedly said that this really is about anime. I'm not an anime expert, so I'm not really sure what you mean by anime about anime. And then the Patrick talked about seeing this author's works. This ending was not particularly successful, skillful. He has done a better ending. And I'm not really sure exactly, because I don't know other films, in what way the ending of this anime was not so successful. I would like to know.
You mean this particular?
Yeah. And then my fourth question is, you know, in this anime, there is a doll, like a obake doll, who was going to destroy. Who exactly does this doll represented? I thought that this was the fat boy's assistant, a rather handsome man, but I wasn't sure. And then I'm still not sure what's the difference between anime and manga.
Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, here, we'll have this one.
Okay, let me get to Mike. I guess that was number 3. What I was saying was that I've seen most of the movies by Satoshi Kon, the director of this, and while I can understand why he did what he did in this movie, I found a previous movie of his called Millennium Actress much more satisfying. It's a wonderful story, and it is truly like a love story to movies. You can tell the man loves the entire medium and is able to encapsulate an entire actress's life based on the movies that she was in. And it's just a wonderful progression. Some of it's seamless. It's got the same dreamlike quality here, moving from scene to scene with apparently no logical continuity, but it works on a visceral level, on an organic level. You feel it as much as you understand it. And I just, like I say, to me that is my favorite Kon movie. That's all I meant by that.
Well, just quickly, in terms of part of what I would just conjecture, guess that this film seems to be saying about 21st century Japan, I find is a pretty harsh critique of the fetishization or commodification of everything, whether it's a religious icon, Statue of Liberty, consumer goods products like a microwave or a shiny new refrigerator, or even young girls who are hiking up their skirts so the otaku men can use their keitai and flash pictures of their underpants, which is a very prominent scene featured in the same parade with the consumer goods and the Daruma dolls and the Statue of Liberty. So this mishmash of symbols that are fundamentally devoid of meaning, except as fetish objects. And to me, watching it this time, I felt that was Kon's harshest critique of contemporary Japan, that this is grotesque, this is disgusting and meaningless. But of course, as an artist, he's splashing it in front of you in this color and pageantry, and ugliness too. I mean, I think he's emphasizing that. You know, the head sprouting out of the muck, and even the kind of disgusting sexuality of the film, I think, is quite pronounced. There's the rape scene, of course, which is happens in this quasi-dream world. But even when the older man, the chief, is stuck in his dream and sitting up on the throne, and Paprika gets on his stomach and is sort of pressing into the muck of his body, and the suggestion that he's being sexually excited and aroused, and then he blows up himself into one giant thing. That all to me seems to be almost to be fueled by a kind of anger at the emptiness of this contemporary consumer obsessed culture. I guess that would be my answer to some of the commentary.
Maybe I should try and answer the one about manga and anime. I think you probably know many of the definitions of manga and anime, but for the other people in the audience, I can try and illustrate how confused it is, because in America we say cartoons, and when we say cartoons in America, we mean TV cartoons sometimes we mean newspaper cartoons. It's a very broad, blurred definition, and actually manga in Japan is similar today in that it's a very blurred word. It's a very vague word, and it can mean 4-panel cartoons, yonkoma manga. It can mean single-panel cartoons, shitokoma manga. It can mean long narrative graphic novels, would be story manga. And if you're of an older generation, I have white hair, so I can remember, but people in Japan used to say, like if their children were watching TV too much and too much anime on TV, they didn't use the word anime. They would say, "Sonna manga bakkari miccha dame da yo." They would say, "Don't watch all those manga," even though they were anime. So for the older generation, manga can also mean anime. But generally today, I think in Japan, manga means the printed material. It can mean single-panel cartoons, 4-panel cartoons, newspaper comic strips, and mainly the long story comics or narrative comics that we would probably call in America graphic novels. But what's really confusing in Japan today is that in the industry, people refer to paperback tankobon or the comics, and they refer to those in English as comics. So it's completely confusing, just like it is in America, because the word comic book doesn't really mean much in English anymore, and that's why people use the word graphic novels. And then animation or anime are pretty similar. And anime is just a contraction of the word animation. And it wasn't used in Japan until relatively recently, really until the 70s. Before that, they would say animation, or they would say manga eiga. And before that, they would say doga, which just means, moving pictures. I hope that's my interpretation.
I don't know if there's any more.
I think there were 2 more questions, but I don't remember exactly what they...
Yeah.
Osanai, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so.
Right, it transforms.
Sometimes she thought it was Himuro, and
Yeah,
then it
yeah.
became
It was
Osanai.
And
That's right, Himuro.
and sometimes it just has a doll's face,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Doll traditionally, that particular doll, like a princess character, something like that? Because I really don't know.
Well, it's a traditional doll. I have one at home.
Yeah.
I have one at home.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Good question.
But there were also times when it was she thought it was representing Himuro.
Right, right.
The otaku fat
Mhm.
guy. Yeah.
His assistant, his partner, because he's Tokita.
Right. I'm sorry, not Himuro.
The-
Otokita, yeah.
yeah.
Tokita,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't take too much in this film at face value. I think that's a bit of an in-joke too, because if you take I think Fred's theory is probably accurate, that he's at least in part a representation of this otaku king figure, Okada-san, right? It's Okada-san, who is a real guy and used to be very fat. He's now much thinner. And if he is in part a representation of that, then it's a kind of wink or joke with otaku that, oh, you get the girl, right? We'll give you the girl at the end of this one. Right, right. And I also think that it's telling that she says that he's just a child inside, right? He can't grow up. And there are many, many lines about responsibility, the failure to take responsibility for technology, for your actions, for your behavior. And so allegedly she embraces this fat man-child at the end of the film. And then Paprika leaves a note advising the cop, I forget his name right now, the guy with the mustache, the cop. She advises him to go to the movies, right? He says he doesn't like going to the movies. Konakawa. She tells him to go see a movie, and she says the movie she tells him to see is A Kid's Dream, or Kids Dreaming, right? And he goes up to the ticket booth, and his last line is, "One adult, please," right? One adult ticket to go indulge himself in this film called A Kid's Dreaming. So I think if you take all of those points, I also think Kon is suggesting, as one of his colleagues, Anno Hideaki, has suggested, that particular Japanese men have never really grown up, that they're existing in this infantile state. I mean, I don't want to take it too far, but it certainly seems like, I guess what it means, I wouldn't take at face value her falling in love with the otaku guy at the end of the film. I think. And I think it's quite brilliant, something I didn't notice earlier as clearly, how Kon works into this film the ad copy, but it's garbled ad copy. So it's almost infantile ad copy that makes not real sense and then some sense. And one of the lines I wrote down was, "The dense forest turns into a shopping district," which I thought was, some of them were very revealing. They're celebrating this. The dense forest turns into a shopping district. I mean, it sounds like something Miyazaki would regale against, exactly.
I just want to say about that bit at the end, in the note where Paprika recommends going to see, I guess, the latest Satoshi Kon movie, because all the others were, she also says that Dr. Chiba is going to be changing her name to his soon. And as somebody who's been married for more than 2 decades, trust me, it is the people who love you who criticize you.
All right, well, we'll take a couple more in the audience, and then it's time to wrap up. So, but this has been great.
First of all, I just want to thank you guys for this presentation today. I truly enjoyed it. And the question I had is that this movie, when it was made rated R, so was it intended when it was created to be more of an adult film, or is it just an adult film here in America? Is it different in Japan? And he also had a question.
Just throughout this entire symposium, I noticed that you guys have really focused on postmodernism, although you haven't really talked about it that much. But I just wanted to note several things that I saw that I considered to be stemming from postmodern thought. in this film. The first thing was the abandon of the depth of meaning and religiosity through the dolls that were in the parade. He said that was he was symbolizing that. Also, as American society has become more postmodern and has moved away, or is starting to move away from Christianity as the kind of dominant religion, does this cause a trickle-down effect into Japanese thought? Is Japan losing its Shinto Buddhist religiosity? And also, I noticed that at the very end of the film, or toward the end, in the final battle scene, one of the characters, I don't know if it was Paprika, it might have been, but she said something along the line of, your dreams become the final truth. And I was curious if, and that also ties into the man carrying around the pillow earlier, as he was fantasizing about that girl, and that had kind of become his own reality. Do you see a paradigm shift in Japan, moving away from their Shinto Buddhist roots? And just your comments on that.
Yeah, with the Shinto Buddhist roots question, I think there's a lot of evidence out there. We saw some of it in this movie, and I spoke about some of it in the presentation that I gave early this morning, and in my book. I think there's a lot of evidence out there that the Shinto Buddhist roots are not gone. They may be de-emphasized to a certain point, but they are always in the culture, sometimes in disguise, but they're there. And maybe we're still trying to figure out, those of us who are on the outside of the culture are still trying to figure out what form it's taking and how it's important. But the fact that these things have not disappeared altogether or mutated into something so radically different that they literally have no meaning. I mean, you still have a lot of the forms and the traditions of Buddhism and Shinto in Japan. They're still very much a part of the culture, even if you want to, worry about percentages, like 80%, 20%, whatever. It's still there. And it's going to be there for a while, even if it comes in a disguise, even if the Mikos star in something like Sailor Moon. I mean, they're there.
I guess I would have a slightly different take in answering that question, because in my experience in Japan, the locus of actually most traditions has been the family. There's nothing equivalent to the church, and never was anything equivalent to going to church on a Sunday for Americans or for Christians. And the family, in some respects, has taken a real beating in Japan over the bubble and post-bubble years. I think one of the sort of cliches now in Japan is that it's a generation of parents, the baby boomers, who worked very, very hard to achieve middle class or upper middle class status, but they didn't get to know their children very well. And there's a real generation gap in Japan between younger Japanese and their parents' generation. And so, to that extent, some of the Buddhist traditions that were practiced in part by the family seem to have suffered. And I know that the temples in Japan are in crisis mode because they are unable to attract young converts or young priests to the temples. So they're actually embarking on recruitment programs to try to get young Japanese to become Buddhist priests. So to the extent that the traditions themselves were part or practiced by the family, and in the context of the family, I think it's fair to say they have suffered, certainly in the bubble and post-bubble years in Japan. And I think that's part of the commentary in the film, the religious icons being tossed about with the microwaves and the refrigerators.
I know there was a question about also the film. I think it was if there was a rating of the film. I don't have an answer. Maybe somebody else does. But I would suspect that this film was not an issue. It was not given a rating in Japan. There is a aiding body. There's a body that can censor films. But I very much doubt that this would have been given a rating like we would find in America. There's nothing in this film that I saw that probably would be an issue in Japan. Yeah, but you did notice, of course, that the nude figures, that the crucial areas were all kind of blurred out. There was nothing really graphic in their private parts. So that once you clear there, I think you're clear with just about everything else in Japan.
Yeah, but there is maybe there's a broader question here, which there is by comparison much more flexibility and leeway in Japan when it comes to rating or censoring material for a younger audience. I know that folks who in the manga industry on this side of the ocean who handle distribution in the U.S. Are frequently have to cover up or redraw or ask for a redrawn body part so that it's less revealing, or even for clothing to be added to a character so that they can sell it in the United States. So that often happens. And also the manga publishers and distributors here, especially I guess the three big ones, Viz Media, Tokyo Pop, Del Rey, and Dark Horse, have all sort of unofficially, and Viz, that's what I meant, Viz Media, have all unofficially agreed to have a rating system applied to their manga, to the books themselves. So you'll see rated M for mature audiences, rated, I don't know what all the, T for teen, okay. So there's a much stricter approach in America to those concerns than you find in Japan today. I mean, I'm still, as a kid who grew up in America, still when I see some of the displays of manga in the local convenience stores, it's a bit startling. It's a bit bold. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, though, that just because there's not the same ratings in Japan doesn't mean that hordes of 5-year-olds would have seen this film. I mean, it's marketed in particular ways, and people know things about the directors. So it's not to say that if there's not a rating, everybody sees it. I mean, I think it would be marketed in particular ways. But yeah, there's no one at the ticket stand checking ages, and there's not the same kind of rating system like that.
It's much more self-selecting.
It is. Like parents just, yeah. Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.